within the Crimario project, and I'll be running today's webinar and moderating all activities. I'd like to first begin by handing over to Martin Kauki-Glott, who is the project leader for the Crimario project, to make some brief introductory remarks, after which we'll dive straight into the webinar and hopefully keep to the timeline which we have scheduled. We're looking at a total duration of approximately 90 minutes. So thank you again for joining us. Martin, I'll hand over to you. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Thank you, Andrew. So good morning, one and all, and welcome to Crimario's first edition of Tuesday Second Chance in Southeast Asia. The scope of Tuesday Second Chance is to offer a forum through which participants can discuss particular past incidents at sea, moderated by Crimario, after having drawn lessons learned from particular incidents, again, happening at sea in the safety and security domain. But what is Crimario exactly? Crimario is an EU-funded maritime capacity building project where we focus on both maritime safety and security. We started in 2015 in the Western Indian Ocean, and in 2020, the decision was taken to extend the project eastwards to South Asia and Southeast Asia, including a maritime law enforcement component. Conceptually, we aim at promoting interagency and regional cooperation. We are semi-autonomous by nature because we are an EU-funded project, funded by the EU's development budget, not the Common Security and Defence Policy budget. So we are neutral and unbiased in our ambitions. Our ambitions being predominantly benevolent in mind, that is to enhance maritime governance and to promote multilateralism. We have a flexible framework and we're able to interface at the strategic, operational and tactical level. And practically speaking, we're a dynamic team, predominantly retired Navy and Coast Guard officers who come together to offer a variety of products to our beneficiary partners. We have been embedded in the EU's strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific several times, with particular reference to our IORIS info exchange platform, which we are offering to the region, included in future governance, come later on this year. With that, I hand the floor back to Andrew to commence his very interesting brief on the Erika case. So Andrew, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. So I'd like to start very, very briefly with a few minor administrative issues. You'll note that in the chat, I've already asked everybody if you could please to keep your microphones muted at all times to avoid interfering with the presentation. However, do feel free at any time to either activate your microphone, use the chat window, or raise your hand in the app if you wish to make a comment or ask a question, or if, more importantly, something which has been said is not particularly clear. So you're more than welcome to intervene at any time. As I said, we're looking at a total duration of about 90 minutes. The presentation itself should take no longer than 30-40 minutes. And at that point in time, we will open the floor for any interventions, either comments or questions from your side. And we are really eager to hear your views and your insights into this particular case and into similar concerns that you may have within the Southeast Asia region. Tuesday Second Chance is not a forum for us to criticize the decisions of others. It's a forum where we look at a past incident, We have the benefit of perfect hindsight, so we can look at that incident in a very objective manner from a distance and understand which were the decisions and actions that contributed to a particular outcome. And the idea of doing this is very simply that it's cheaper to learn from other people's mistakes or shortcomings than it is to make our own mistakes. And that's really what is at the heart of Tuesday's Second Chance. It's an opportunity to learn from these particular incidents and give us food for thought about how we as individuals, we as administrations, we as states could potentially address similar challenges in an equally effective manner. Today's presentation is actually related more to maritime safety than security, and it addresses the case of the motor tanker Erika. So I'll begin by starting my presentation. Isabel, can you confirm that the screen is live?
Yes, it's perfect.
Thank you very much, Isabel. So, as I already indicated, we're looking at an incident which, in essence, is a marine pollution incident. However, we're going to try and look at the underlying causes in a little bit more detail. And this is where the emphasis of Tuesday's Second Chance will always be. Breaking down an incident and looking deeper into what happened to understand where the factors were that actually caused the problem, rather than the apparent factors which we see reported in the news perhaps, or which are immediately apparent. And today we're going to speak about an incident which involved the motor tanker Erika, which broke up and sank off the Atlantic coast of France back in December of 1999. Now, relatively old case, but even the older cases tend to have some very interesting lessons which we can bring into today's world and use to form our thinking and form our planning when it comes to addressing these issues. The objectives for this webinar are, first of all, to examine the facts of the breakup and sinking of this vessel and of the subsequent pollution which was caused by this marine casualty. And more importantly, then to identify those key events that occurred during this incident and the decisions which were taken in response to these key events. At the end of the day, maritime safety and maritime security are very human issues, in that it is the human decisions which are taken that really affect the outcome. Yes, there are factors outside the human domain, such as weather, such as the environment, which have an impact on how things will actually happen. But at the end of the day, at the core of everything is the human decisions which are taken. And then potentially discuss some alternative scenarios, the what if questions. What if something had been done differently? What if this particular legal regime was different? And so on and so forth. So playing through various scenarios with a view to then thinking about how can we do this better today? How can we respond better today? How can we prepare better today? This is the Erika in her final hours, well, the stern portion of the vessel, at least, in her final hours in the Bay of Biscay. As you can see, she was a relatively large vessel. At this point in time, the stern section was in fact under tow. You can see the tow rope extending to the right of the picture. Although a few hours after this picture was taken, the stern section sank as well, and the vessel was lost in relatively deep water, however, still causing significant pollution, as we will see. She was a relatively older vessel, which was built in 1975. So at the time of the incident, she was already 24 years old. But as I said, a relatively large vessel, 184-meter oil tanker. She was sailing at the time under the Maltese flag. But as always, the ownership of the vessel was relatively complex. She was chartered by Total, which are a large French company. She was owned by a Maltese shell company. She was managed by an Italian company, and in fact was classified under the Italian Classification Society. As I already said, this happened in December of 1999, and it's worth pointing out that in August of the previous year, 1998, the ship had completed her so-called special survey. So that's the survey which happens approximately every 5 years, and she had been inspected and found to be fully compliant with all requirements of a vessel of that type. The particular voyage in question, when this incident occurred, the Erika departed Dunkirk in France. So it's a port on the French coast of the English Channel, as you can see at the top of the map. And she was carrying a cargo of approximately 31,000 tons of what is called number 2 heavy fuel oil. People who are familiar with the petroleum industry know that HFO, heavy fuel oil, is an industrial fuel used partly by shipping, but also in large industrial facilities like power stations. People also know that HFO, unfortunately, is perhaps the most polluting of petroleum products, in that it contains large amounts of toxic chemicals and is also relatively heavy and non-volatile, so it doesn't evaporate into the air very quickly and therefore remains within the marine and land environment for a long time. This cargo was bound for Livorno in Italy, and the vessel was also planned to make a bunkering stop in Algeciras in Spain, which is right at the southern point of Spain. And this is a very typical type of intra-European voyage, where a vessel is used to carry cargo around Europe, relatively short voyages, and voyages which are key to ensuring that heavy cargoes can be carried around the European continent. So any of you who are perhaps familiar with the English Channel and shipping within it know that it's a relatively complex area from the perspective of navigation. There's a traffic separation scheme which stretches all along the English Channel with 2 lanes, obviously, with the southbound lane, or the southwestbound lane in this case, being closer to the French coast. This also requires vessels to report to the various vessel traffic stations. And 2 of these stations are VTS Cherbourg and VTS Corsen in France, with Corsen also being what's called a cross in French, which is a rescue coordination center. So the VTS in Corsen has a dual role of both vessel traffic services as well as search and rescue. And the vessel was proceeding normally, reporting to vessel traffic services in Cherbourg on the 9th of December at 11 o'clock at night. And the next morning, reporting to the vessel traffic services in Corsen at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Weather conditions were far from ideal. There was a wind from west-southwest, which was force 7 to 8 coming out of the Atlantic. And given the way that the English Channel becomes relatively shallow and is enclosed, this tends to build up into relatively heavy seas. And in this case, there were seas in excess of 4 meters. Not impossible conditions for a vessel of that size, but clearly conditions which already would require a degree of care and a degree of navigational awareness. Unfortunately, the weather conditions continued to worsen, and they increased to winds which were force 8 to force 9, and the seas rose from 4 meters on average to seas which were above 6 meters, which are, as you can imagine, heavy seas, even for a vessel of the size of the Erika. On the 11th of December at about 12:40, the crew of the vessel noted that the vessel began to list, that is, tilt towards starboard. And this list, this tilt of the vessel, began relatively gradually, but also was increasing significantly. And in fact, less than 2 hours after it had been initially noted, about an hour and a half after it had been initially noted, that is at 14:08 on the 11th, the master of the vessel decided to transmit a distress message. And this distress message was transmitted on the Inmarsat Charlie network, so on the satellite communications network, which is relatively standard for all large commercial vessels. Also, given the weather conditions and the fact that the vessel was listing to starboard, the captain, the master of the vessel, took the decision to turn his vessel to run before the seas. In other words, to have the seas coming from behind. This reduces the strain on the vessel because the vessel is traveling with the seas instead of slamming into them. It also makes for a far more comfortable ride for the crew, and they're also better able to move around the vessel to respond to any emergency. And in fact, in response to this turn with the seas now from the stern, the list of the vessel, the tilt, which had increased to 15 degrees, began slowly to reduce again to just 5 degrees. Given that they had now turned the vessel, the master decided that it was safe for his crew to conduct an inspection of the vessel to understand what exactly the problem was. Because prior to this, the waves washing across the deck of the vessel as it moved into the seas made it too dangerous for the crew to move on the deck. And therefore, he then deployed his crew onto the deck of the vessel, and they conducted an inspection around 2:30 that afternoon. And this inspection revealed that there was buckling, that is folding and cracking of the deck just forward of the number 2 ballast tank. Now, I'm not sure whether everybody's familiar with the concept of ballasting. Basically, when you have a large vessel like the Erika, which carries liquid cargoes, when it is not carrying a cargo, it obviously floats very high in the water. And this is not efficient from a propulsion perspective because the propeller will not be in the water. And also it causes excessive strain to the vessel because the vessel is too buoyant and moves around too much. And therefore, the vessel has a system of ballast tanks, which are empty tanks into which it can pump seawater and bring the vessel lower in the water so that the propulsion can function effectively and so that the vessel's structure is not overly strained by movement. And number 2 ballast tank, just forward of it, the inspection found that the deck was bending, buckling, and that there were cracks in the deck. The master then informed the French authorities, because obviously this particular distress was being coordinated by French authorities, that the tilting of the vessel was now under control. And he passed this information to the next rescue coordination center down the coast from Corsen, which is MRCC Etel. And they in turn passed this information to the Naval Operations Center in Brest. Why the Naval Operations Center? Well, in France, coastal services, coastal response services are organized under the Navy in various districts along the coast. And this particular area fell under the Naval Operations Center in Brest. Having assessed the situation, both the Naval Operations Center and the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center decided to keep their search and rescue aircraft and helicopters on standby, available to respond should there be any further problems, but to take no further action because the information that they were receiving from the master indicated that he appeared to have the situation under control. So the vessel was in no immediate or imminent danger, and therefore they could afford to wait and watch how the situation developed. Throughout this whole incident, and this is quite notable, there was only one voice contact, direct voice contact between the Rescue Coordination Center and the master of the Erika. All other contacts happened through satellite communications as written communications. And this is significant because, as I'm sure many of you know, when you speak to a person directly, you can understand a little bit about the situation they are in, even from the tone of their voice and from the manner in which they are speaking to you. But unfortunately, in this particular case, there was that only one voice contact, and that happened at 14:55. And in it, the master confirmed that he had the situation under control and required no further assistance. However, what he did not say was equally significant. He said absolutely nothing about the structural issues which the vessel was experiencing. So that cracking and buckling of the deck plating, which his crew had found, was not mentioned by the master to the authorities ashore. In addition, at 15:14, so approximately another 20 minutes later, the master cancelled the distress message that he had sent over Inmarsat C and changed this to a sécurité message. So again, those of you who perhaps are not familiar with search and rescue messaging, there are 3 levels of message. There is a Mayday, which is the most urgent message. There is a pan-pan message, which indicates that somebody's life may be in danger. And then the lowest level of message is a sécurité message, which is basically indicating that there is a situation related to maritime safety. And the master at 15:14 downgraded his initial message from a Mayday to just a sécurité. At about 4:30 that evening, the master altered his course to 085 degrees, so almost due east. And his intention was to head to the port of Donge, which you can see marked on the map with the red pin, which is here near Saint-Nazaire. And the idea was he was going to seek shelter there and have the opportunity to assess structural issues with the vessel and decide on how to proceed with both his voyage and with potentially repairs to the vessel if they are required. In addition, an hour after that, he cancelled even the sécurité message. So now there were no messages out there from the vessel which indicated that there was any form of problem with the vessel. But he did also inform the MRCC that he was heading to a port of refuge, in this case, the port of Donge. So you can see that the master, having assessed the situation, decided that the safest course of action available to him was to proceed to a port of refuge on the coast of France in order to assess the situation, make any temporary or permanent repairs required in order to be able to continue his voyage. Having received this information, the MRCC informed all of the relevant authorities what was happening. Again, it's important to point out that at this stage, in the information being distributed between the French authorities, there was nothing regarding structural issues with the vessel. Why? Because the master had not reported these to the MRCC. So at this point, 5:30 on the evening of the 11th, the French authorities still have absolutely no insight into the fact that the Erika is suffering from what is essentially severe structural issues, because vessels do not begin to buckle and crack easily. If they are buckling and cracking, then you have a major problem. The MRCC also asked the master of the Erika which was his intended port of refuge, and he in turn confirmed that this was the port of Donge. And he gave an ETA, an expected time of arrival, of 6 o'clock in the evening on the next day. So they had an idea of at what speed he was proceeding at and how long it would take him to reach this port of refuge. So at this point in time, everybody was under the impression, beginning from the master and ending with the authorities ashore, that although there had been a situation, although this vessel required to take a number of steps to ensure safety, there was no emergency situation being faced. The first indication that the French authorities had that there may be some structural issues with the Erika came at 9:15 that evening. And it did not come from the master. It came from the company which was managing the vessel. And they informed the French authorities that there was the potential for a minimal leak of oil products due to the structural damage which had been suffered by the vessel. Now, this is clearly a very important piece of information if you are accepting a vessel into one of your ports as a port of refuge. Having received this information, it was followed up by the French authorities. And in fact, the master of the Erika confirmed this information to the MRCC at 22:50. And so now, for the first time at 22:50 in the evening, the French authorities have this definitive confirmation from the master of the vessel that there is a degree of structural damage which has occurred to the vessel. Beginning from the very early morning of the 12th, unfortunately, weather conditions began to worsen even further. And although the vessel was running before the sea, so it had the weather coming from behind it, it still began to develop a very significant list or tilt to starboard. Knowing that weather conditions in the area were not good, the MRCC repeatedly attempted to contact the vessel, were unable to do so until 4 o'clock that morning. And at that time, the master of the Erika confirmed where he was at that point in time. Then things began to deteriorate extremely quickly. Less than 2 hours later, from a vessel which was underway heading towards a port of refuge, at 05:54, the master reported the hull was breached, so it had broken open. The vessel was experiencing severe flooding, and he again declared a distress. And at this point in time, he also requested that the crew be evacuated for the vessel. In a period of just over 2 hours, the damage increased significantly, and at a few minutes past 8 that morning, the ship's back was broken, and literally the ship broke in half, and the bow and stern sections separated. Stern section obviously contained the crew quarters and accommodation, and because the search and rescue assets had already been on standby and available for use, these were quickly launched at 7:37, and just a few minutes after the vessel had broken in half, the evacuation of the crew by helicopter began. A considerable operation at a considerable distance from shore. However, about 90 minutes later, all of the crew had been evacuated. So there was no loss of life of the crew due to this incident. Both of the sections remained afloat. However, the bow section subsequently sunk in the night between the 13th and the 14th of December. In the case of the stern, as I've already mentioned, there were attempts to tow it further away from shore. The reason being is that the authorities knew the potential for significant pollution and wanted the vessel to be as far away from shore as possible. However, despite their best attempts to tow it away, the stern section also sank at 2:45 on the 14th of December. The consequences were far from minimal. This particular casualty, as I said, was carrying a very toxic and polluting product, HFO number 2, heavy fuel oil number 2, and it caused significant pollution across a very large part of the North Atlantic coast of France. 400 kilometers of shoreline between Finistère and Charente-Maritime. Anybody who's visited that particular coastline will know that it's a ecologically extremely important area. There are significant fisheries activities in the area. There is significant biodiversity in the area. And it's also an extremely rugged coast, as you can see from the picture. So it makes it extremely difficult to conduct cleanup efforts. It's also made a lot worse by the fact that they have a very significant tidal range of about 5 to 6 meters. So at high tide, oil can be brought very far up onto the shore and then left there by the tide as it recedes. So there was a significant impact to both wildlife as well as coastal industries like fisheries and aquaculture. This particular incident was one of the biggest drivers for change when it came to legislative standards for oil tankers, especially within the European Union, this having happened within a European state. The first response, obviously, or the first consequence of this incident was a national inquiry, as you can well imagine. Government people wanted to understand what had happened and why it had happened. And clearly, this obviously led to legal proceedings of various types against the owners, the operators, government, potentially people who had been involved in the coordination of response. And in fact, 3 senior naval officers were accused with criminal charges of having failed in their duty. They were subsequently acquitted, found not guilty, that is, because it was very quickly identified that they did not have the information to be able to adequately respond to this particular incident because the information flow was extremely poor. And this was something which came out in both the legal proceedings and the inquiry, that the internal communications between agencies in France were not of an adequate level to ensure an adequate response. They were probably the major issue that hampered the response. In addition, this incident also resulted in 3 legislative packages. Now, these were legislation which is relevant only to the European Union, yes, but they were significant legislative packages known as the Erika 1, Erika 2, and Erika 3 legislation. And they touched on almost every area of maritime safety and also, in a way, security. First of all, the technical standards were beefed up because the reality was that this vessel was a vessel which was fully compliant with the technical standards of a European registry, the Italian registry in this case. And yet, despite that, this vessel had broken apart. Well, clearly the standards were not good enough. In addition, they enhanced the surveillance of maritime traffic. So for the first time, European states now had to maintain an awareness, maritime domain awareness, of what was happening around their coast in order to be aware of these incidents. It addressed issues of liability and compensation, but perhaps the most important thing and most significant thing which came out of this legislation was that for the first time, Europe as a whole had a new maritime safety agency, the European Maritime Safety Agency, EMSA. And in the intervening years, EMSA has become a key player in both maritime safety and maritime security within the European Union. In addition, it established the formal concept of ports of refuge, so ports where a vessel could go to be able to shelter after an incident happened or in order to ensure that the incident did not get worse. And it required states to indicate where these ports of refuge were and how they could be accessed. So in summary, we had an incident involving an aging vessel, 24 years old, that had been inadequately maintained and had been subjected to an inspection regime that was not fit for purpose. Now, it's important to point out here that it had been inadequately maintained, not because the owners had not complied with the maintenance schedule, but because the maintenance requirements for this vessel were not sufficiently stringent. Take that vessel and put it into the weather conditions that it encountered, and that was more than the ship's structure could actually sustain, and it began to break apart. On top of that, we had a master who did not adequately communicate how bad the situation was to the authorities, and communications in general, both between the ship and shore, as well as between agencies ashore, all suffered from difficulties. And this meant that any accurate appraisal of the situation was even more difficult than it had to be. So, having looked at this particular case study, and prior to opening the floor to you for discussion and questions and remarks, There are some points to ponder which I'd like you to perhaps think about. Were there any operational measures that the French authorities could have implemented that would have improved their response? What was the impact of the poor quality and restricted flow of information regarding the actual situation on board the Erika? Did it really affect the outcome? If the French authorities had been aware that there were structural issues at the beginning of the incident, could they have done something differently, and would that have changed the outcome? And what about procedures? How important is it to establish procedures regarding logistics, places of refuge, and so on and so forth prior to the event happening? And it's important that when we look at these incidents, we don't focus on the wrong issues. This is something which, whenever there's an incident at sea, be it maritime safety or security, especially in the media, you'll see that there will be a focus on particular issues. What unfortunately happens is the focus may be on the wrong issues. Generally, when an incident happens, there are root causes, what I call causal factors, and contributing factors. The root causes are the reason why the incident happened, and they are the ones that we need to address. There was clearly a root cause in this particular incident that the inspection regime for that type of vessel was inadequate, and therefore damage to vessel or degradation of the vessel was not being caught in a manner which was timely. The causal factors, these are factors which obviously contributed to the particular incident, were issues, for instance, like the fact that the master did not have a procedure for reducing speed in heavy weather, and therefore took his weakened vessel and drove it at maximum speed into heavy weather. And contributing factors were the weather itself and other issues like poor communications, etc., etc. But it's important that when we consider these cases, what we really need to identify are the root causes. There is never a single cause to a particular incident, but we need to identify those ones which, should they be eliminated, this type of incident cannot, or at least should not, happen again. So at this point, I would like to stop the presentation. I'd like to open the floor to all the participants to see if there are any comments, remarks, questions. As I said, you can use the chat, you can raise your hand in the app, or you can just switch on your microphone and make your intervention as, how, and when you wish. So the floor is open. Any questions or remarks that you'd like to make about this particular incident, especially based on the points to ponder? From an operational perspective, is there anything more that the French authorities could have or should have done? When a ship is breaking apart, is there anything more that you can do? What do people think? Could they have intervened earlier? Was there a possibility of having intervention assets available to them earlier? Or is this something that is impossible or unlikely that can happen? How does it happen in your countries? Do you have standby vessels available to respond to this particular type of incident? Or do you have to depend on commercial tugs or commercial salvage services in order to intervene? What about the flow of information? Would earlier knowledge of the structural issues to the vessel have in any way changed the outcome of this particular question or this particular incident? Would it have made the outcome better? Would it have not had any difference to the outcome itself, but perhaps to the subsequent response? And what about procedures? Do we have the procedures in place? Are we ready to designate places of refuge in our states? where a vessel with structural issues can potentially shelter if it is having an issue. So I do have a comment on the chat, which comes from Sylvain Levet, and he's wondering whether the master should have alerted the authorities right from the beginning as to the gravity of the situation. And that's a good point. Had the authorities been aware of how bad the situation was from the beginning, perhaps they could have taken a more effective response. But the question you have to ask then is, did they have the means to do so? The French state, particularly now, together with also the UK and the Channel, have a number of large salvage tugs contracted to them 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And these provide their first response mechanism to incidents such as the Erika, but there's also been a number of other incidents which have occurred off this particular part of the French coast. So yes, if the master had alerted the authorities earlier, that definitely would have given the option to respond earlier. But then on the other hand, you also have to have the means to do so. And contracting a standby vessel 365 days a year is an extremely expensive proposition. Not all states can afford to do that, although not all states have to afford to do that individually. Perhaps they can do that in a pooled manner. But if you have early warning and you also have an appropriate response mechanism, potentially, in this case, the Erika could have been taken further offshore. She still would have sunk. The damage to the vessel was such that there was no way to save her as a ship in those weather conditions. But she could have been taken further offshore and therefore perhaps minimized to a certain extent the pollution. So yes, had the master alerted authorities earlier, it may have reduced the consequences of this particular incident. And in other incidents, potentially it could actually prevent the incident from happening. So that, I hope, addresses your question, Sylvain. I'm open to any other questions or remarks. Oh, here we have another one. Yes, this is also a question which was actually put in the registration, where during the registration for this particular webinar. And this is regarding the registration of vessels of a certain age. And the question was, what are the standards or guidance available regarding vessel registration based on the age of the vessel? And in this case, clearly the age of the vessel and its hard use during its operational life contributed to the structural failure. As such, there are no direct recommendations regarding how old vessels may or may not be when you come to register them on your ship registry. What I can tell you is, after this particular event, the Maltese ship registry, because this vessel was registered in Malta, no longer registered vessels that were older than 20 years old. And the reason for that is because clearly vessels which are older than 20 years old, and even sometimes less, begin to suffer from structural issues. So it's up to each and every flag state to choose whether they wish to accept or not vessels above a certain age, or in the case of specific vessels of a certain age, institute an inspection regime which is more strenuous, more rigorous. The inspection regime in this particular case, which was imposed on the Erika, was not sufficient for a vessel of that age. And in fact, these inspection regimes have been modified and they have been upgraded to attempt to catch the issues which can happen to these vessels over time. In the case of the Erika, what had clearly happened was that corrosion within the ballast tanks, that is rust and the eating away of the metal in the ballast tanks, had happened much quicker than it was thought previously. And therefore, the structural strength of the vessel was nowhere near what would have been expected for that particular ship. And therefore, when taken into heavy weather, as it was, with a very heavy cargo, 31,000 tons of oil, the vessel was subjected to physical stresses which were beyond its ability to handle, and that's why the vessel began to break up. So this question which came during registration regarding the age of vessels and whether we can do anything to restrict them, yes, every flag state can do so. The only problem with that, if you like to call it a problem, is that as a flag state, you will be losing customers. So you have to take that into account. There are still many older vessels out there which wish to be registered somewhere. And if you make your requirements very strenuous, you will lose those as potential customers, but you will gain reputation for your flag, which is also important. So any other remarks, questions about what we've spoken about today? I'd like to re-emphasize that it's very important that we always look at the root causes of an issue. The contributory causes and causal factors such as weather, etc., they're important, but none of them are relevant unless that first root cause or root causes, if there are a number of them, actually happen. And when we analyze these cases, be they maritime safety or maritime security, understanding what the root cause is important to understanding how we can move forward and not have these things happen within our administrations and within our states. So it's very important that we address these issues. So any other remarks, comments, or observations? The floor is definitely open to everyone. Please use the chat or raise your hand if you wish to speak. What about communications? How good are communications in our states? How well would we pass the information about this incident between our agencies? Because we can only expect our agencies to react as well as the information that they have. If our agencies do not have the appropriate information, accurate information, timely information, that is information when we need it, then it's very difficult to expect them to react appropriately. And this is something that we need to keep in mind, especially when we're establishing new agencies. Yes, they need the best equipment, the best ships, the best helicopters, the best pollution response equipment. Yes, they need the best people, the most qualified people, the most motivated people. But at the end of the day, that particular agency can only react and respond as well as the information it is receiving. That information is the on and off switch for that agency. So if it is not receiving the information appropriately, if it is not receiving the information that it needs to analyze and generate its response, that expensive, well-resourced agency will actually be relatively ineffectual because it is not equipped with an on and off switch. So, very important. Again, I've got a question here from Sylvain Levet, and it's regarding communication. And he's saying, well, look, clearly there was an exchange of information with the MRCC and the master. So there was no technical issues. So is it possible that there were other issues which were impacting this particular scenario? And he's asking whether the IORIS platform, which as you may know is Crimario's information exchange platform, could it have helped to address this particular incident? Information exchange platforms of any kind, whether they are IORIS or any other interagency exchange platform, are absolutely key to handling any incident because they ensure that everybody has the same understanding of a situation. This is like the old story about the elephant and the blind men. 3 blind men approach an elephant. One catches the tail, another one catches a leg, and the other one catches the elephant's trunk, its nose. The first one thinks that the elephant is like a rope because he's holding on to the tail. The second one, who's holding on to the leg, thinks that the elephant is like a tree. And the third one, who is holding on to the nose or the trunk of the elephant, thinks that the elephant is like a snake. And because they have different pieces of information about the same thing, they have a completely different perception about what's happening. And it's the same in maritime incidents. Unless all agencies have the same level of information, they will have a differing understanding of what this means. A rescue coordination center, as its name suggests, thinks of things in terms of search and rescue. That's its job. Its job is to prepare and operate to save lives at sea. But clearly, the Préfet Maritime, the maritime prefect in Brest, his interests were more significant. He had to think about the safety of life at sea, but he also had to think about issues like pollution, environmental protection, thinking about a place of refuge for the vessel. So he had considerations which he needed to think about, which needed different information sets. And unless we have a system where we can exchange this information, the available information, across our agencies and make sure that they have a common understanding, unfortunately, we'll finish up with this approach where each individual is holding a different part of the elephant, to describe it like that, and therefore has a different understanding of the particular problem. So yes, interagency communication is critical for this particular type of response. And without proper interagency communication, there is no ability for the various agencies and specialist agencies to be able to respond adequately. So I'm seeing a very interesting comment here by Nitash Lala. I apologize for my pronunciation of names. It may not be perfect. And they are pointing out that it is very important that when such an incident happens, the master of the vessel should be reporting to both his class authority, in this case it was the Italian authority, and the coastal authorities, all the issues that are affecting his vessel: flooding, damage, the draft before the incident and the draft after the incident, what stress the vessel is under, and what he calculates the impact is on his vessel or her vessel. So yes, this is very important. But I will point out that masters may be reluctant to do this unless they know that they are going to be able to find a place of refuge to solve this problem. So to encourage masters to report honestly about what the situation is of their vessel, in return, authorities have to show them the readiness to provide support to the master in dealing with these issues. What unfortunately happens in many cases is that when a vessel has experienced a degree of damage, either due to fire or structural damage, ports tend to say, no, I don't want that problem, go away. And therefore, masters may be reluctant to report this damage to the authorities. We've seen a case of this relatively recently with the vessel which caught fire and sunk in the vicinity of Sri Lanka last year, causing massive pollution in the area from the various containers on board the vessel. The fire on board that vessel started 10 days before. and it started while the vessel was still in the Arabian Gulf. And the master reported the problem that he had on board his vessel, but the authorities in the region said, well, you're not safe to come into our ports. We do not want to deal with this problem. The impact of that was the problem got worse and worse and worse, and subsequently resulted in the vessel sinking off Sri Lanka and causing massive environmental damage. So while I fully agree that the master has an obligation to report to authorities regarding damage to their vessel and problems which are occurring on board their vessel, the only way we can ensure that that happens as coastal states is by responding in kind and saying, okay, we will help you deal with this problem. If our response is, well, I don't want that problem in my backyard, go away, then we are encouraging masters to conceal problems and hide them from authorities rather than to be open about those particular issues. So it's a very fine balance between the good flow of information and making sure that that information does not prejudice the position of the vessel. But a very important point made there by Nitash Lala regarding the obligation of the master to report on incidents to the vessel and the state of his or her vessel to authorities. So thank you for that point. Any other questions or remarks regarding the particular scenario? So as you can see, when you take one of these scenarios and dig into them a little bit deeper, with the benefit of 20+ years of hindsight, we can still bring out very relevant lessons and relevant points for our response today. And that is at the heart of the Tuesday Second Chance webinar series. So I'm hoping that after this first edition of Tuesday Second Chance, you'll continue to join us for later editions. We'll look at things like maritime law enforcement. We'll look at things like high seas boardings, use of force, search and rescue, in order to identify those lessons which are important to how we plan and operate and how we set up our administrations and our legislation in today's world to respond adequately to these different threats and challenges. So if there are no other points or remarks which anybody would like to make, I'll give one last opening for anybody to raise their hand or put a question or comment in the chat. In the meantime, I would like to thank you all very, very much for attending this webinar. Before we draw to a close with today's edition, I do have one further request. Our public relations officer, Isabel, is online at this time. And for her, it's very important to publicize these activities. So if you could potentially switch on your cameras, if you're comfortable to do so briefly, Isabel will take a screenshot, which will be added to our publicity materials. So those of you who are comfortable with putting on your cameras, I'll be very glad to see your faces and say hello. And Isabel will take the opportunity to take a quick screenshot. Isabel, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. So I don't see so many faces, but so it's not a problem.
They're coming online. They're coming online.
Yes, yes. There is a distance between all the people and us in Europe. So just waiting few seconds more and we'll take a screenshot. So you can smile. Yes, thank you. And I will send you on the chat the link to the YouTube channel where you can see or replay the last Tuesday Second Chance.
Thank you really very much, Isabel. So as Isabel said, she'll be passing you the link for the recording. Also, what will happen is in the next 1 or 2 days, we'll write up a short summary of discussions, and we will forward this to all the registered participants. So you have also a written record of what we discussed and addressed during this webinar. Thank you very, very much for attending. We've appreciated your presence with us today online. and we look forward to welcoming you to future editions of Tuesday Second Chance. Martin, I will pass over to you for any closing remarks which you may have.
Thanks, Andrew. And very briefly, once again, you presented a case study very comprehensively and very clearly, for which the Cremario team is most grateful. And I really do hope that the participants found what we had to present interesting and potentially having drawn some lessons from the case study. To reiterate, this was the first webinar that we organized for Southeast Asia under the Cremario umbrella. And so I thank those participants who I noticed, particularly from the region, from Singapore, the Philippines, and Indonesia. As Andrew mentioned, our intention is to continue having these webinars, which have the scope of bringing operational managers and policymakers together to deliberate those very delicate situations that seafarers may encounter at sea. With that, I'll conclude today's Tuesday Second Chance, and very much looking forward to seeing you in the next edition. Thanks and goodbye.
So again, thank you to everybody. We look forward to seeing you at future editions. I wish you a brilliant remainder of the day, and hope you keep safe and are helped in a little bit by these webinars in addressing the various and big challenges which we face within the maritime domain. So wishing everybody a great day and look forward to seeing you again. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.